I'm Marcus Cole, and welcome to Feral Soul Stories. What I'm about to tell you is the kind of story I've spent 25 years searching for. A story that I nearly didn't include in this collection because I wasn't sure any words could do it justice. But some stories demand to be told. Some stories refuse to stay quiet. Picture this. An 82-year-old woman with stage 4 cancer, weeks from death, escapes her hospice facility in London and flies 4,000 miles to Siberia. She has an oxygen tank, a walking cane, and a promise she made 26 years ago to a dying tiger cub she held in her arms. Everyone told her it was impossible. Tigers don't remember. Even if they did, she'd never survive the journey. Even if she survived the journey, she'd never find him. Even if she found him, approaching a wild Siberian tiger, a 400-pound apex predator who hadn't seen her in more than 2 decades, would be instant death. Margaret Sullivan didn't care. What the park rangers found 3 days later, deep in the snow-covered wilderness of the Russian Far East, would challenge everything science thought it understood about memory, loyalty, and the bonds that form between creatures when one of them is dying and the other refuses to give up. Here's the question that haunted me when I first heard this story. When you make a promise to a wild animal, does it count? Does it bind you the way promises between humans do? And more impossibly, more beautifully, does the animal keep their end of it too? I've been asking that question my entire career. Margaret Sullivan answered it. This is her story. The documentary was called Ghosts of the Taiga, and it aired on a Tuesday evening in February, 3 years ago. Margaret Sullivan was not supposed to be watching television at 11 at night. The hospice staff at Greenfield Care Home in Kensington, a clean, quietly carpeted place that smelled of antiseptic and fresh flowers and the particular sadness of endings, preferred their residents to be asleep by 9. Sleep was part of the protocol. Sleep was part of managing what was coming. But Margaret had never been good at managing things that were coming. She had spent too many years running toward them instead. She was lying in her narrow bed with the television volume turned down, so low she had to read the subtitles, watching footage of snow. Endless white forests, gray winter skies pressing down over a landscape so vast it made England seem like a small room. The narrator was speaking about the Sikhote-Alin Reserve in Russia's Primorsky Krai, one of the last strongholds of the Amur tiger, also called the Siberian tiger, one of the most endangered large predators on Earth. The documentary was good. Whoever had made it knew what they were doing. The cinematography was extraordinary, the kind that required months in extreme cold to capture, and the narration was measured and elegant without being sentimental. Margaret had always respected good documentary work. She lay with her blanket pulled up and her oxygen tube in place and watched the footage with the appreciation of someone who knew the difference between manufactured drama and the real thing. She had seen footage of Siberia 100 times. She had lived there for 6 months of the most important year of her life. The sight of those forests always did something complicated to her chest, a tightening that was equal parts grief and longing, the way you feel when you see a photograph of someone you loved and lost. She was watching with that familiar ache when the camera panned across a frozen meadow and caught something moving. An ancient tiger. The narrator was explaining that this particular male, designated T27 in the reserve's database, was estimated to be 26 or 27 years old, almost certainly the oldest wild Siberian tiger ever documented. A scientific anomaly, a ghost by any reasonable expectation, given that wild Amur tigers almost never survive past 15 years, given the brutal mathematics of cold and hunger and territory and time. Researchers from 3 universities had traveled to the reserve specifically to study him, hoping to understand what had extended his life so far beyond any established precedent. The camera zoomed in on his face. Margaret Sullivan sat up in bed. Between the tiger's eyes, painted in dark fur against the lighter background of his forehead, was a marking in the shape of a star. Not approximately star-shaped, not resembling a star if you used a bit of imagination. A clear, unmistakable, 5-pointed star, a marking as distinctive as a fingerprint, as individual as a name. She had traced that marking with her finger 26 years ago. She had memorized it the way you memorize the face of someone you love, the way your hands remember a thing they've held 1,000 times. She had memorized it sitting in the cold rehabilitation center in Primorsky Krai in the winter of 1998, holding a dying tiger cub in her lap while antibiotics dripped slowly through a line into his tiny, limp body, talking to him in a low voice, telling him, against all medical probability, against the quiet pessimism of the exhausted veterinary staff, against the evidence of his own shallow, labored breathing, that he was going to be all right. She had been wrong about many things in her 82 years. She had not been wrong about that. Tears were running down her face before she fully understood why. Her hand reached toward the television screen, toward the massive, ancient, magnificent creature moving through the Russian snow. Her fingers touched cold glass and nothing else. "Frost," she whispered to the empty room. After that, she did not sleep. To understand what Margaret Sullivan did next, you have to understand who Margaret Sullivan was. She was born in Bristol in 1941, the second daughter of a librarian and a mechanic, and she grew up in the particular way that children of wartime Britain grew up, pragmatically, without excess, with a precise understanding that life did not owe you comfort, and that sentimentality was a luxury for people who hadn't seen what she had seen. She trained as a nurse at 17, and by 20, she was working in field hospitals during the Malayan emergency, tending to men whose wounds were beyond anything her textbooks had described, learning very quickly that the difference between living and dying was often not about the severity of the injury, but about the force of the will. She married late, at 34, a kind Scottish engineer named Robert Sullivan who understood her restlessness without trying to cure it. They had 2 children, Michael and Patricia, both of whom grew up watching their mother go precisely where she was needed: disasters, war zones, understaffed rural hospitals, the difficult places most people avoided. Robert died of a heart attack in 1997, quietly, in his sleep, and Margaret grieved him with the same ferocious completeness she brought to everything else. The grief hollowed her out in ways she hadn't expected. She had spent 40 years being competent, being useful, being the person who knew what to do. And then Robert was gone, and the children were grown and busy and kind, but overwhelmed with their own lives. And Margaret found herself for the first time with nothing that urgently needed her, sitting in the house in Kensington with her hands at her lap, feeling the particular desolation of a woman who has spent her entire life in motion and has suddenly, without warning, been asked to stop. The advertisement appeared in a wildlife magazine she'd picked up in her doctor's waiting room. Wildlife rehabilitation volunteers needed in Russia. The Sikhote-Alin Reserve was expanding its tiger rehabilitation program. No special qualifications required beyond a willingness to work in difficult conditions. Margaret's daughter Patricia said, "Mom, you're 57 years old. Russia in winter. Don't be ridiculous." Margaret's son Michael said, "Mom, tigers are dangerous, and it's freezing there." Margaret booked her flight 2 days later. She had spent 40 years being sensible. She was tired of sensible. The rehabilitation center was 3 hours east of Vladivostok, at the end of a road that seemed to deteriorate with increasing intentionality, as though testing whether new arrivals were serious before permitting them to arrive. The buildings were low and concrete and functional, heated by wood stoves that the staff fed constantly, and the whole compound smelled of pine resin and animal and the particular cold that comes not just from temperature, but from remoteness. The cold of being very far from anywhere. The staff were exhausted. They were 3 veterinarians, 1 Russian, 1 German, 1 South Korean, supported by a rotating cast of volunteers who came with varying levels of skill and commitment and almost universally underestimated how hard the work would be. They were rehabilitating bears, deer, wild boar, an assortment of birds, and occasionally the animal the whole reserve existed to protect, the Amur tiger. Margaret was assigned to general duties: feeding, cleaning, restraint assistance during medical procedures. She was 60 years old, arthritic in both knees, and she outworked volunteers 20 years her junior. The Russian vet, Dr. Yuri Petrov, watched her for 3 days before admitting, "You are better than most of the students we get." Then in March, frost arrived. The ranger who brought him in had found him alone in the forest, his mother's tracks leading to evidence of a poacher's snare 50 meters away. Orphaned at approximately 3 months old, the cub had survived alone for an estimated week, an eternity at that age, in that temperature. He had pneumonia. He was severely malnourished, his ribs visible beneath orange and black fur that seemed too large for his diminished body, his eyes crusted with discharge, his breathing shallow and rapid and wrong in the way that breathing is wrong when something important is failing. "He won't make it," Dr. Petrov said quietly, not unkindly, looking at the cub on the examination table. "We can try, but the pneumonia is advanced. He is very young." Without his mother, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Margaret looked at the cub. The cub, with what seemed like enormous effort, opened his eyes and looked back. And there, between his eyes, was a marking in the shape of a star. "I'll take the overnight watch," Margaret said. Dr. Petrov looked at her. "We don't expect volunteers to." "I'll take the overnight watch," Margaret said again. Her voice had the quality it had developed over 40 years of standing in rooms where people were dying and the argument about what could and couldn't be done had become irrelevant. It was not unkind. It was not loud. It simply did not leave room for contradiction. She took the overnight watch. The first night was the worst. The cub's temperature spiked to 41 degrees Celsius at 2 in the morning. His breathing deteriorated to a rattling wheeze that filled the small medical room with the sound of his effort, of his body working against itself, of lungs that were losing the argument. Margaret sat beside his pen, wrapped in every layer she owned, and did what she had done in field hospitals in Malaysia and Oman and Sierra Leone. She talked. She told him about Robert, about the way her husband had laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, doubling over with the anticipation of the punchline before anyone else had reached it. She told the cub about Bristol in the 50s, about the smell of her father's workshop, about learning to ride a bicycle on a street that sloped at precisely the wrong angle. She told him about the first time she had held a child who was not going to survive, a young soldier barely 19 in a hospital tent in Kuala Lumpur, and how she had held his hand and talked to him about nothing important because the important things couldn't be said and the nothing things could. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said. "I don't know if it helps. But if I were where you are right now, I want someone talking to me. I want to know I wasn't alone." The cub's temperature broke at 4:47 in the morning. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of obvious crisis resolved. His breathing simply, gradually, over 20 minutes, became less labored. The rattling diminished. His small chest, those visible ribs that Margaret had been watching with terrible attention, rose and fell with something approaching regularity. Dr. Petrov arrived at 6 to find Margaret still in her chair, still talking, the cub asleep with his chin resting on the ledge of his pen in the direction of her voice. "You should sleep," Petrov said. Later, Margaret said, "He's not through it yet." He wasn't through it yet, but he was going to be. She named him Frost on the 3rd day, when he was stable enough to be moved to a larger recovery pen and first took the bottle from her hand. It required patience she hadn't known she possessed. Tiger cubs being raised by humans are not automatically cooperative. They are, in fact, small packages of determined will, needle-sharp teeth, and an approach to problems that involves biting first and considering alternatives not at all. Frost had been weakened by illness, but not subdued by it. The first time he managed to stand fully on his own 4 legs. 4 days into his recovery, on a Tuesday afternoon while sleet tapped against the facility's metal roof, he promptly used this newfound capability to knock over his water dish, step directly into the resulting puddle, and look at Margaret with an expression of profound surprise. She laughed so hard she had to sit down on the floor. The laughter had come from somewhere unexpected, from a reservoir she hadn't known still existed, and it felt so unfamiliar that she touched her own face afterward, almost verifying it. As he recovered, Frost's personality emerged with increasing emphasis. Curious, imperious, prone to ambushing her ankles from behind whatever object he had most recently decided was a suitable hiding place. He had opinions about the schedule. He had opinions about the quality of his food, which he communicated through a graduated series of expressions ranging from mild disappointment to outrage, so theatrical it bordered on performance. He had a particular chirping sound he made when he was excited. Not quite a full vocalization, something between a squeak and a greeting, and he used it every morning when Margaret arrived, which she did not permit herself to find as affecting as she found it. She found it devastatingly affecting. She had always been fond of animals in the abstract way of people who grew up with pets and understood their value. She had not been prepared for what it felt like to be trusted by a wild creature. The first time Frost climbed into her lap of his own volition, not during a medical procedure, not while she was feeding him, just because he apparently decided that her lap was the most satisfactory location currently available. She sat completely still for 45 minutes, so as not to disturb him, her knees aching, her back protesting, unwilling to end it. The other volunteers noticed. They were gentle about it. Most of them were in their 20s and early 30s, young idealists who had come to Russia for reasons that ranged from genuine conservation commitment to the vague romantic notion that meaningful suffering in a foreign climate would improve their character. They liked Margaret in the cautious way of young people who recognize competence in someone much older than themselves and aren't quite sure how to navigate the resulting respect. "You're different with him," said a German volunteer named Liesel, watching Margaret guide Frost through his first tentative attempts at coordination exercises. "You're different with him than with the others." "Am I?" Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "The others you care for." "Him you." Liesel searched for the word. "I don't have the English for it." Margaret didn't offer the word. She thought she knew what it was, and naming it seemed dangerous. "You understand," Dr. Petrov said one afternoon, watching her work with the cub, "that he cannot stay like this. He must learn to be a tiger, not a companion animal." "I know," Margaret said, "and that you will eventually leave." "I know that too. Many volunteers find this difficult." "Yes," Margaret said. "I imagine they do." She understood the theory of what Petrov was saying. The practice of it, the actual living through of it, turned out to be different from anything the theory had prepared her for. The protocol for wild animal rehabilitation is well established and exists for good reasons. The animal must be kept wild, must not associate humans with safety or food or comfort in ways that will endanger it after release, must be prepared for a world that does not contain the people who saved it. Margaret understood this. She had implemented versions of this principle throughout her nursing career. The careful management of attachment, the professional distance that made it possible to be present with suffering without being destroyed by it. She managed the distance with the bears. She managed it with the deer. She managed it, partially and imperfectly, with Frost, maintaining the necessary protocols, encouraging his instinctive wildness, introducing prey behavior training, stepping back when she should step back. And then she would arrive in the morning, and he would make that chirping sound and look at her with those amber eyes, and she would think, "I am in significant trouble here." Over 6 months, she watched Frost become himself. She watched the gaunt, dying cub become a healthy juvenile, all outsized paws and growing muscle, and increasingly alarming attempts to apply hunting techniques to anything that moved. At 4 months, he was the size of a large domestic dog. At 6 months, he was bigger than any domestic dog she had ever encountered. At 8 months, with 2 weeks left on her visa, he was a young male Amur tiger who had just successfully hunted a prey item for the first time and who still, when Margaret sat with him in the late afternoon, pressed his head against her knee with the same gesture of casual possession he had used as a 10-week-old cub. She watched him learn to be wild, and she felt the complexity of this. The way each milestone of his recovery and development was simultaneously a milestone toward the day she would leave. She did not tell the other volunteers how she felt about it. She told Frost. This was, she would have readily acknowledged, not entirely rational behavior. He was a tiger. He did not understand the words. But he listened. He genuinely listened, his amber eyes tracking her face with the concentrated attention that was one of his most unnerving and most beautiful characteristics. And the act of saying things aloud to him clarified them in ways that saying them to herself did not. She had spent 40 years talking to patients who might not hear her, or who heard her but could not respond, or who were beyond the point where words made logical sense, but for whom the presence of a voice was still meaningful. This did not feel categorically different. "I know this is right," she told him, for weeks before her visa expired. "I know you need to be out there. I know what you are and what I am and what this can and can't be." She was scratching behind his ears. He had recently discovered that this was one of life's great pleasures and would position himself with increasing directness to facilitate it. His purr was low and steady, resonant against her hand, a vibration she could feel in her wrist and her forearm and somewhere deeper than that. "But I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss you in a way I can't quite explain to anyone, because anyone I explain it to is going to tell me you're an animal, and it isn't the same." Frost bumped his head against her knee with a force that moved her sideways 6 inches. He was 8 months old and already coming to her shoulder when they sat together. He was going to be enormous. She looked at the star-shaped marking between his eyes. She traced it with her finger, slowly, the way you trace something you are memorizing. The dark fur against the lighter background, the distinctive geometry of it, 5 points spreading outward from a common center. "I promise," she said. "I'll come back. When you're free and wild and living exactly as you're meant to live, I'll come back and find you. I'll see you there. Not in here. Out there." A pause. "I always keep my promises. Ask anyone." Frost's eyes were half closed, his purr continuing its steady tempo. She left 2 weeks later. He was released into the reserve 3 days after that. She knew, rationally, that he would not wait, that he would move into his territory and become himself completely, solitary, territorial, wild, everything he was made to be, and that the woman who had sat with him through fever nights and talked to him about nothing important would recede into the background of his experience the way early memories recede, replaced by the overwhelming vividness of the present. She knew this, and she kept her promise anyway, the way you keep promises that you know may never matter to anyone but yourself because the keeping is not about the audience. Then life intervened. Life intervenes. This is what life does. Margaret returned to London in September 1998 with a suitcase of Russian cold-weather gear, an arthritic knee that had worsened considerably, a portfolio of photographs she would look at most evenings for the next decade, and a grief she had not anticipated and could not quite explain to anyone without watching their expression shift into the particular mixture of sympathy and incomprehension that means. "I understand you're sad, but also I'm not entirely sure this is a proportionate response to the departure of a tiger." She wrote to the center every month for the first year. Dr. Petrov sent updates. Frost had been released into the reserve in November. He had been seen several times near the southern monitoring station. He appeared to be healthy. He appeared to be thriving. At 10 months, he had been photographed by a camera trap near the river. At 14 months, he had been seen marking territory. At 18 months, the tracking collar placed on him at release showed him covering a range of approximately 450 square kilometers, large even for a male Amur tiger, Dr. Petrov noted, suggesting exceptional vitality. Margaret read each message 3 times and printed them and kept them in a folder she labeled, with characteristic practicality, "Russia, Tiger Updates." And then the updates became less frequent. Dr. Petrov retired in 2002. The center's email address changed twice. The tracking collar battery died in 2003 when Frost was 5 years old, and the center moved to camera trap identification using distinctive markings rather than GPS monitoring. The world moved on as the world moves on, carrying the particular velocity of things that are not attended to. And then Margaret's own life, with the remorseless efficiency of time, began filling with things that needed her. Her daughter Patricia's difficult pregnancy, her son Michael's divorce, 3 grandchildren arriving in 7 years, the medical emergencies that accumulate around any large family, given enough time, the slow deterioration of her own body that she managed with increasing stubbornness and decreasing success. She thought about Frost. She thought about Russia. She put money aside twice for flights that she never booked. In 2003, she researched the reserve's current contact information and drafted a letter she did not send, because by the time she had finished drafting it, she had already received a phone call about her mother's fall, and the letter was superseded by a different kind of urgency. In 2007, she came very close. She had the flights booked. September, A reasonable window before the worst of the Siberian winter, before the reserve's access roads became impassable. She had the itinerary planned. She had told no one about it, understanding that announcement would invite the arguments she didn't have the energy to counter. Her granddaughter Sophie was born in August 2007, 3 weeks premature, small, and struggling, in the NICU for 11 days. Margaret canceled the flights from Sophie's mother's bedside, sitting with Patricia through the nights of uncertainty, holding her daughter's hand while the neonatal nurses did what neonatal nurses do. She did not book again after that, not for any single reason, but for the accumulated weight of all of them. She found other ways to keep contact with what Frost represented. She donated to the Amur Tiger Conservation Fund every year. She read the reserve's annual reports. She joined an online community of tiger conservation supporters and contributed to discussions with the careful precision of someone who had actually handled an Amur tiger cub in the winter of 1998 and knew what their chirping sound meant. She answered questions from other volunteers preparing for their own expeditions to Russian facilities, sharing what she remembered about what helped and what didn't, about the reality of the work versus the romance of it. It was a way of staying connected. It was not the same as going. She knew it was not the same. Her knee worsened progressively through her 70s, requiring a replacement at 74 that went well and another at 77 that didn't, leaving her with a dependence on the walking cane she had initially resisted and eventually accepted with the pragmatism she applied to most obstacles. The cancer was diagnosed on a Wednesday in November, almost matter-of-factly, at the end of a routine appointment that had not been entirely routine. Her oncologist was direct and kind. The staging was unambiguous. She drove herself home from that appointment. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold. She thought about what she had and hadn't done with the years she'd been given, and the arithmetic of it was complicated in the way that most important arithmetic is weighted differently depending on which things you counted, and it mattered enormously which things you counted. She had been a good nurse, a good wife, a good mother and grandmother, imperfect in the specific ways that capable people are imperfect, too direct, occasionally too independent, not always available in the ways that availability is measured. She had done useful things in the world. She had kept most of her promises, not all of them. That was what she thought about, sitting in the kitchen with the cold tea, in the gathering dark of November evening in London. Not the thing she had done, but the one thing she had promised and not yet done. She was 82 years old when the diagnosis arrived. Stage 4 ovarian cancer, metastasized. The oncologist was kind and precise. The language was careful and honest. Words like palliative and comfort care and quality of remaining time arranged themselves into a sentence that meant there would not be much more time, and the time that remained was not for fighting, but for living. She was admitted to Greenfield in January. Her children visited every Sunday. Her grandchildren came on alternating weekends. The staff were gentle and competent. The flowers were always fresh. Margaret was very grateful for all of it, and she was dying of the wrong thing. Not the cancer. She was not afraid of the cancer. She was dying of incompletion. She was dying with a promise unmet, with a word she had given to a wild creature in a cold Russian night, and then, not broken, never broken, simply deferred, year after year, in the patient accumulating way that deferments become betrayals without ever intending to. She was dying of 26 years of I'll go next year. And then she watched the documentary, and she saw the star-shaped marking on the ancient tiger's forehead, and she understood that next year had finally become now. She called her granddaughter Sophie at 6:30 the following morning. Sophie was 26, and she had her grandmother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and a career in wildlife photography that Margaret felt responsible for in the best possible way. She picked up on the second ring, her voice immediately alert in the way of people who receive early calls from grandparents in hospice and have learned to answer quickly. "Gran, is everything okay? I need your help," Margaret said. "I'm going to Siberia." The silence that followed was the kind that contains many things: shock processing, the rapid calculation of practicality, and underneath everything, in Sophie's case, a recognition, because Sophie knew her grandmother, had always known her grandmother in the way of grandchildren who were paying attention. of what this was. "Tell me about the tiger," Sophie said finally. Margaret told her. All of it. The 1998 expedition, the dying cub, the 6 months, the promise, the 26 years of good reasons and deferments. The documentary, the star-shaped marking, the tracking data she had found online at 4 in the morning, cross-referencing the reserve's publicly available camera trap records with her own memories, building a case for a conclusion she had reached at 11:17 p.m. the previous evening when Frost's face had appeared on her television screen. Sophie was quiet for a long time after. "Gran," she said finally, "you're in hospice. You're on oxygen. The doctors have told you." "I know what the doctors have told me," Margaret said. "I've been telling patients the same things for 50 years. I know exactly what it means. It means you're very ill. It means this trip could kill me." A pause. "Sophie, love, I'm dying in a bed in Kensington, surrounded by sympathy and fresh flowers. I'm going to die whether I go to Siberia or not. The question is not whether I die. The question is whether I keep my promise first." Another silence. "He might not remember you," Sophie said. "It's been 26 years. He's a wild tiger, Gran. Even if it is him, even if that marking is the same." "I know that," Margaret said. "I know he might not remember. I know I might get there and see him from a distance, and that will have to be enough. I know all the ways this might not be what I'm hoping for." A pause. "But I made him a promise, and I intend to keep it. With or without your help, I'm going to Siberia. I would very much prefer your help." Sophie flew to London the next day. Discharging yourself from hospice care is not a simple administrative process. There are protocols. There are concerns. There are conversations with doctors who are trying very hard to be both honest and compassionate and are finding these objectives increasingly difficult to reconcile in the face of an 82-year-old woman who is listening politely, nodding, and has clearly made her decision before entering the room. Dr. Hadley, Margaret's physician, spent 40 minutes explaining the risks. Margaret thanked him thoroughly and signed the discharge paperwork. Her daughter Patricia arrived as Margaret was packing. The conversation was not simple. Patricia loved her mother with the particular intensity of a child who has spent her life both admiring and being frustrated by the same person, who has watched that person be magnificent and impossible in equal measure and has long since stopped trying to tell them apart. "You'll die over there," Patricia said. She was crying, which she was trying not to do. "I know," Margaret said, folding a thermal undershirt with the careful efficiency of someone who has packed for cold climates before. "That's not, Mum, that's not supposed to be the answer." "Patricia." Margaret stopped packing and looked at her daughter. "I have been dying since the diagnosis, and I will keep dying until I stop. Nothing about going to Siberia changes that arithmetic. But if I stay here," she paused, searching for the right words. "If I stay here, I will have broken a promise. I will have been a person who said they would do something and didn't do it. I have tried very hard not to be that person. I don't intend to become her now." Patricia sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands against her face. "He's just an animal," she said, muffled. "No," Margaret said gently. "He isn't. He's the reason I came back to life after your father died. He's why I got back up. He is not just anything." She sat beside her daughter and put an arm around her. "Come to the airport with me tomorrow. See me off, and then let me go keep my promise." The journey from London to the Sikhote-Alin Reserve took 31 hours, 3 flights. A car journey on roads that worsened in exact proportion to how remote they became, and a quantity of medication management that Sophie handled with impressive competence. Margaret traveled with a portable oxygen concentrator, a walking cane that had been with her since her knee surgery 14 years ago, and a single photograph tucked into the inner pocket of her coat. Frost, at 8 months old, curled against her chest, the star-shaped marking visible on his forehead, both of them looking at the camera with the expression of people who don't know a photograph is being taken. The reserve's chief ranger was a man named Dmitry Volkov, young, fit, and visibly unimpressed. He met them at the administration building with the expression of someone who has received a difficult phone call and was hoping, against mounting evidence, that the situation might be less complicated than described. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, looking at the oxygen tank, the cane, the unmistakable physical evidence of Margaret's condition. You understand that we cannot allow visitors to enter the tiger habitat. This is for safety reasons. The area you're describing, T-27's current territory, is remote. It is extremely cold, and T-27 is a wild predator. He is not. I understand perfectly, Margaret said. May I ask, the tracking data for T-27, is he still in the same sector he was spotted in last month? Volkov blinked. How did you know? The reserve's camera trap records are partially public. I've been monitoring his movements for 3 months. She reached into her bag and produced a handwritten map covered in notations. He has a preferred route along the river valley in the eastern sector. He's been using the same bedding sites for at least 4 years. At this time of year, given the deer movement, he will most likely be. Where did you get this information? I have contact from my time here in 1998, Margaret said, and quite a lot of time to read during chemotherapy. A pause. I know where he is, Ranger Volkov. I know this reserve. I know this tiger. I am not asking for your supervision. I am asking for your permission. The argument took 3 hours. It ranged across a conference table, several cups of tea, a satellite phone call to the Regional Wildlife Authority in Vladivostok, and at one point a 20-minute pause during which Volkov consulted a thick binder of reserve protocols that appeared to contain no precedent for an 82-year-old British hospice patient requesting access to tiger habitat on the grounds of a promise made to a cub in 1998. There is nothing in the regulations about this, he said, mostly to himself. No, Margaret said pleasantly. I don't imagine there is. Sophie argued on their behalf. An older ranger named Alexei, who had been with the reserve for 20 years, argued on their behalf after hearing who Margaret was. Word traveled through reserves in the way it travels through any small community where extraordinary things occasionally happen, and Frost was extraordinary. Everyone who worked in the Sikhote-Alin knew the story of T-27, the impossible tiger who refused to die, who had outlived every expectation and most of his contemporaries by a margin that the wildlife biologists in Moscow described, in their measured scientific language, as statistically remarkable. What ultimately changed Volkov's mind was not the arguments. It was the moment when Margaret stood up from the conference table, placed both hands flat on the map, and looked at him with the expression she had developed in 40 years of telling people the truth in rooms where the truth was hard to hear. I am dying, she said. Not metaphorically, not eventually. I have weeks. The cancer is in my liver and my lymph nodes and several other places, and I am on oxygen because my body is failing. I know this. I accepted this. I am asking you, Ranger Volkov, not to guarantee my safety because nothing can do that, and I would not believe you if you tried. I'm asking you to let me go into those trees and keep a promise that is 26 years overdue. Volkov looked at her for a long time. He was 34 years old and had worked in wildlife conservation since he was 22, and in that time he had seen remarkable things. A mother bear walking 12 kilometers through snowstorm to return to a relocated cub. A lone wolf spending 3 winters at the edge of a dead pack member's territory before finally moving on. Creatures demonstrating capacities that the scientific frameworks he'd been trained with could describe, but never quite explain. He looked at this small, fierce, dying British woman with her oxygen tank and her handwritten maps, and he made the decision that would make him, in certain wildlife conservation circles, quietly legendary. You will have an escort, he said finally. You will not go alone. Of course, Margaret agreed. They set out the next morning at first light. The forest in February is a different thing from any forest Margaret had encountered elsewhere. The cold is not hostile. It is simply absolute, a cold that predates human presence in these latitudes and does not acknowledge it. The snow was 2 feet deep, pristine in the areas untouched by the wind, and the trees, Korean pine and Mongolian oak and iron spruce, enormous and ancient, created a canopy that filtered the thin morning light into something that fell across the white ground like old silver. Margaret walked. She walked with her cane and her oxygen tank and the escort that Volkov had insisted upon. Alexei on her right, a younger ranger named Pavel on her left, Sophie behind her with a camera she had stopped raising because she understood instinctively that this was not a moment for recording. Margaret walked with the deliberate, careful, relentless pace of a woman who had crossed difficult terrain before and understood that the only way to do it was to simply continue. Her knee ached. Her chest, on which the cancer had been making its unhurried claims for months, reminded her with every steep step that her body was not what it had been. The oxygen concentrator hummed steadily. She breathed the Siberian air, which tasted of pine resin and cold and something older than both, and she thought about nothing except the next step, and then the step after that, and then the step after that, which is how you cross difficult ground, which is how you have always crossed it. She had entered the coordinates into a GPS unit she wore on her wrist. She had spent 3 months studying T-27's movement patterns. She knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had lived in this reserve and paid close attention to what it taught, where he was most likely to be. After 40 minutes, she stopped. "There," she said quietly. The others looked. In the snow ahead of them, partially obscured by the angle of the light, were paw prints. Massive, unmistakable, the prints of a very large tiger. Not running, walking, purposeful, heading toward them. Alexei's hand moved to the tranquilizer gun at his hip. "Don't," Margaret said. Her voice was very calm. "Mrs. Sullivan, please." She looked at him. "If I'm wrong, if he doesn't know me, you'll have time to act. But please, give us a moment first." Alexei looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at her grandmother. She was crying, silently, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold. "All right," Alexei said. "A moment." Margaret faced the direction the tracks were coming from, and she waited. He came through the trees to her left, not from the direction she had expected. He moved the way water moves in cold weather, slowly, with immense latent force. Everything in him can serve for purposes greater than speed. He was enormous. She had known he would be enormous. She had done the mathematics, had understood what 8 months and 26 years added up to. But standing 10 meters from a wild Siberian tiger, watching him move through the Russian forest with the absolute authority of an apex predator in his territory, is a different order of experience from any preparation. He was old. She could see it in the way he moved, the subtle stiffness in his right front leg, the slight hollowness around his flanks, the way his breath came in longer draws than she remembered. He was aging. He was dying, as all wild things eventually die, as she was dying, as everything that lives is always in the process of dying from the moment it begins. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He stopped at 15 meters. His amber eyes, pale gold in the morning light, moved across the group with the assessing intelligence of a creature that has survived by reading situations with complete accuracy. The Rangers, Sophie, the equipment, and then Margaret. She had not planned what she would do. She had not permitted herself to plan because planning assumed an outcome, and she had not been able to afford the hope that specific outcome implied. She simply opened her coat and took out the photograph and held it in front of her, which was not a rational thing to do, and which she did anyway. "Frost," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the same voice she had used in medical tents in Malaysia and at Robert's deathbed, and in 6 months of overnight shifts in a Russian rehabilitation center, talking to a dying cub about anything and nothing. "It's me. It's Margaret." The tiger was still. The forest was still. For 15 seconds that Margaret later described as both the longest and the shortest of her life, nothing moved. Then Frost walked toward her, not charging, not cautious with the wariness of a wild predator approaching an unknown entity. He walked toward her the way a cat walks, toward the person it has decided, on whatever grounds cats use for these decisions, belongs to it. With purpose, with complete lack of doubt about the appropriate outcome of the situation. The Rangers behind her made sounds. Alexei's hand went to his weapon again. Sophie made a sound that was not quite a word. Margaret did not move. She stood perfectly still with the photograph in her hand and watched the most ancient wild Siberian tiger in recorded history walk across the snow toward her. And she felt, underneath the fear and the awe and the overwhelming complexity of what was happening, something that she recognized from 40 years of sitting with people in extremity. The feeling of a thing arriving at its right conclusion. He stopped 2 meters away. She could see every detail of him at this distance. The particular depth of orange in his coat, The way his stripes layered over one another, the old scar along his left flank that told a story she would never know, the slight cloudiness in his right eye that age had brought. She could see his breath, small clouds of warmth dissipating into the Siberian cold. She could see, between his eyes, clear and unmistakable, the star-shaped marking that she had first traced with her finger in the medical room of the rehabilitation center while he lay in her arms fighting for his life. He lowered his enormous head. He pressed his nose against her outstretched hand. What happened next was witnessed by 2 park rangers, 1 wildlife photographer, and a portable oxygen concentrator, none of which were adequate to the moment. Margaret's legs gave way, not from fear, but from the physical impossibility of continuing to stand while containing what she was feeling. She sat down in the snow, which was extremely cold and which she did not notice at all. Frost moved forward and settled beside her, pressing his body against her side with the deliberate weight of a creature claiming its space. His massive head came to rest in her lap. His purr, low, resonant, feeling more than heard, a vibration that moved through her entire body began. "There," she whispered. Her hand was on his forehead, her fingers tracing the star for the second time in 26 years. "There you are. I'm sorry it took so long." Alexei later said that he stood there for 5 full minutes before he remembered to breathe. Sophie did not take photographs. She had her camera in her hands, and she did not raise it. She stood and watched and understood that there are moments that belong entirely to the people living them, and that the right thing to do with such moments is bear witness and be silent. The morning light moved through the trees. Frost's purr continued, steady as a tide. Margaret Sullivan kept her promise. If stories like this touch your heart, stories about the extraordinary bond between humans and wild animals, about the promises we make across the boundaries of species and time, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Feral Soul Stories by Marcus Cole. Join a community of people who believe these connections are real and sacred and worth celebrating. Every week, a new story, real emotions, untamed hearts. She stayed in the forest for 2 hours. This was not planned. No one had planned for 2 hours. Volkov, reached by satellite phone, had a series of reactions that moved through alarm, incredulity, and finally a kind of baffled acceptance that Margaret's nature seemed to produce in most of the official personnel who encountered her. The cold was significant, and Margaret's oxygen tank had a finite capacity, and her body was doing what bodies do when they are using energy they cannot afford to use. But she was warm in the way that transcends temperature. The warmth of a thing accomplished, of a debt finally settled, of a promise kept in full with the only witness that had ever mattered. They talked. This is another thing that sounds irrational and was entirely, obviously true. Margaret talked, and Frost listened with the same amber-eyed attention she had remembered for 26 years, his head in her lap, his purr providing a kind of counterpoint to her words. She told him about all the years in between, about the grandchildren, about Sophie and what she had grown up to become, about Robert, again, how she still thought of Robert every day, how grief didn't end but changed into something you could carry. She told him about the hospice and the documentary and the exact texture of the feeling she'd had at 11:17 p.m. watching the camera zoom in on his face. "I almost didn't come," she told him. "Every good reason in the world told me to stay. And you waited." Her hand moved over the star-shaped marking, back and forth, the way you touch a familiar thing that is almost lost. "You waited 26 years. The least I could do was get on the plane." His purr didn't change. It was constant and deep and undeniably present. The purr of an animal that has come, after its own unimaginable journey through years and cold and hunger and all the vast difficulty of being alive in the wild, to a moment of complete rest. Sophie, standing at the edge of the clearing, understood only later, reviewing the park's tracking data after everything was over, what the collar data revealed about the days before their meeting. Frost had been in the northern sector of his territory, 40 miles from where they found him, for days before Margaret entered the reserve. His movement pattern showed a straight-line travel south, crossing terrain he hadn't been documented in for 3 years, arriving at the coordinates of the eastern river valley. The coordinates Margaret had identified, the coordinates she had walked toward, approximately 16 hours before they arrived. He had not wandered there. He had gone there. He had gone there directly, without the characteristic looping patrol of a tiger covering territory, without stops for hunting or rest beyond the minimum necessary to make the journey. 40 miles in 4 days, through deep winter snow, at an age when everything in his body argued against such exertion. The trackers who reviewed the data could not explain it. Wildlife biologists who were later consulted could not explain it. The language of coincidence was offered and examined and found insufficient. Some things resist explanation. Some things exist in the space between what we understand and what we know to be true, and the appropriate response to them is not explanation but gratitude. They were both very tired by the time Margaret allowed herself to be guided back through the forest toward the vehicles. She walked slowly, more slowly than she had walked coming in. The 2 hours of cold and emotion and the extraordinary expenditure of what remained of her reserve showing in every step. Alexei stayed close on her right side. Sophie held her left arm. They moved through the trees in the thin afternoon light, the temperature dropping as the sun lowered, the forest settling around them into the enormous quiet of a cold Russian evening. Margaret paused at the edge of the clearing and looked back. Frost had risen from the ground and stood at the center of the meadow, watching her go. His posture was not the defensive alert of a predator assessing threat, not the aggressive stillness of a territorial display. He simply watched, patient, ancient, as though he had all the time in the world and understood that this was a goodbye. Margaret raised her cane in a gesture that was partly practical and partly something else. "Thank you," she said, not in the general direction of the forest or the universe or the concept of unexpected grace, but directly to him. "For remembering, for coming. Thank you." Frost stood in the snow for a long time after they left. The tracking collar recorded his position as stationary for 47 minutes after Margaret's group departed the area. Then, unhurried, he turned north and began the long walk back toward his territory. Margaret Sullivan died 9 days later. She died in Sophie's cottage in Devon, not in the hospice. Patricia had relented, as Margaret had known she would, as Patricia always ultimately relented when confronted with the full weight of her mother's conviction, and the cottage had been arranged in the days before departure. A small stone house with windows overlooking green fields and hills. Michael flew in from Edinburgh. Patricia drove down from London. The grandchildren took turns sitting with her in the last days, telling her about their lives, about what they were building in the world she was leaving. She died on a Thursday morning, peacefully, with Sophie holding her hand and the photograph of Frost. 8 months old, the star-shaped marking visible, the look of a creature at the beginning of everything, on the table beside her. She was not afraid. She had kept her promise. The reserve's chief ranger sent a message to Sophie's email 11 days after Margaret's death. T-27, the ancient Siberian tiger, estimated age 27 years, had been found by remote camera in the eastern meadow, the clearing where he and Margaret had met, lying motionless. Rangers had investigated on foot and confirmed that he had died of natural causes. His body showed no signs of injury, no evidence of starvation. He had simply stopped. He had died in the place where they had met. The message was factual and professional and contained one additional note that Ranger Volkov had added at the bottom, perhaps despite himself, perhaps because some things insist on being recorded even by the people most resistant to recording them. The body was found with his head resting on the ground in the same position as when we observed him with Mrs. Sullivan. I don't know what to make of that. I thought you should know. Sophie Sullivan is a wildlife photographer now. She has won awards for her work documenting Amur tiger conservation, and when people ask her why she chose tigers specifically, she tells them part of the story. Enough of it to explain, not enough to be adequate. Because no amount of words is adequate. She knows this better than anyone. There's a photograph in her studio that she has never published and will never publish. She took it without meaning to. Her camera was in her hands, and she raised it reflexively. A photographer's instinct she caught halfway and decided to follow. It shows a clearing in the Sikhote-Alin forest in winter morning light. An old woman sitting in the snow. A tiger with his head in her lap. The woman's hand on his forehead. Her face turned toward him. Her expression not visible from this angle, but visible in every line of her posture. Rest. Completion. The unmistakable look of someone who has finally arrived at the place they were always going. Sophie looks at it sometimes. She thinks about the fact that he traveled 40 miles to be there. She thinks about 26 years of migration, of cold and hunger and seasoned solitude, of all the years Frost lived in the forest being exactly what he was, wild and free and magnificent, exactly as Margaret had wanted for him, exactly as she had worked to make possible. She thinks about the moment when the tracking collar data shows him turning south, leaving his territory, moving with atypical directness toward coordinates he had no logical way of knowing. She thinks about promises, about what it means to keep one, about the strange, undeniable, scientifically inexplicable fact that sometimes the keeping goes both ways. I've told a lot of stories in 25 years. I've sat with elephants who mourned and wolves who remembered and tigers who recognized the people who saved them across years and continents and every reasonable expectation. I've looked for the words that explain these things, and I've found them insufficient every time because what these stories are actually about can't be contained in explanation. Margaret Sullivan's story doesn't need my explanation. It needs only to be told. She made a promise in 1998 to a dying cub who could not have understood the words. She kept it 26 years later at enormous cost in the last weeks of her life. And he, the ancient, impossible 40-mile traveling, 16 hours early tiger, he kept his end too. I don't know what that means. I know that it happened. I know that the tracking collar data is real, and the photograph is real, and the rangers who watched it happen are real, and the emotion in Alexei's voice when he described it, months later, to a researcher documenting T-27's life history, was real. I know that Margaret Sullivan died without regret. I know that Frost died in the place where she had kept her promise. And I know this. Some bonds are made in moments of extremity. One creature dying, another refusing to accept it. And those bonds, once made, are not diminished by time or distance or the ordinary cruelty of life. They simply wait, patient and certain like tigers in snow, like old women with photographs in their coat pockets, like promises that were meant with everything. They wait to be kept. If Margaret's story has stayed with you, if it has done what I hope it has done, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. Do you believe in the bonds that defy explanation? Have you ever kept a promise that cost you everything and found that the cost was worth it? This community exists because of people who believe these stories matter. If you believe they matter, share this one. Some stories deserve to travel as far as a tiger in winter, as far as an old woman with a walking cane and an oxygen tank and a promise that would not let her rest. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Feral Soul Stories by Marcus Cole, please do. Every week, a new story from the 25 years I've spent documenting the extraordinary bonds between humans and wild animals. Real emotions, untamed hearts, new stories every week. Margaret Sullivan kept her promise.